I'd like to welcome you all to this Enterprise Summit hosted by myself and my colleagues from Radley. Radley itself has been acting as a troubleshooting consultancy firm for 14 years now. And in the last 4 years, their focus has been increasingly on the cultural sector. Our focus throughout that time, and the focus of our clients, has been very much around that interplay between enterprise and governance. More broadly in the cultural sector, but particularly in museums. I think this has demonstrated a number of things to us. That the issue of enterprise undoubtedly is of fundamental importance to the current state of play in museums and to their future. We've also realised that there's some excellent and innovative practice going on across the country. And this is not simply the case in the nationals or the large regional museums, but across the piece. Our engagement across the country, though, has also revealed that there are still significant swathes of the sector who have not been able to maximise their assets, such as their buildings and their collections, and not been able to encourage the necessary culture change that has to accompany a move to an enterprising approach. So my colleagues and I, along with the support of the Arts Council, came up with the idea of hosting some sort of event to bring together a group of like-minded individuals, some of the forward-looking and innovative sector senior staff, to explore ways of helping the broader museum sector. With a great cross-section of chief execs, directors, and representatives of some of the key sector bodies: Arts Council, Heritage Lottery Fund, Museums Association, and AIM. However, to start the event, we thought we should provide some further context and food for thought. And we have two speakers to start with, Peter Latchford and Ian Watson. The first, and I know no man better at providing food for thought, is my esteemed colleague, Professor Peter Latchford OBE, who's going to elaborate on some of the work we've undertaken and also outline what we see as the key elements of an enterprising museum.
Given that you're leaders in the sector, I thought you might find the topic of leadership interesting, and it's particularly interesting in the enterprise setting. The work we've done on leadership, part of what they'll say about leadership, of course, is that they want decisive, kind of Winston Churchill leaders. But they don't want those Winston Churchill leaders to tell them what to do. They want them to tell other people what to do. People have a very narrow conception of what leadership is. Now, the reality of leadership, you'll know this, is that leadership is contingent, i.e. the best form of leadership depends upon the circumstances you face. And a very similar, useful metric or approach that we've taken on leadership is to say, look, there are basically 4 different situations that you can be faced by, and they require different leadership styles. So if you've got a crisis on, then you need a Winston Churchill sort of leader. You need a decisive authoritarian leader. If you've got a crisis, you need action and you need it fast, and someone needs to say what happens. If the thing you're faced by, if the issue you're faced by is one of complexity, knowable complexity, so I don't know, you're building an ocean line or something, so it's knowable, there are variables unknown, but there are many of them, or Julie building M-Shed, for instance, a complex situation like that, then you need a planning disposition. The chief leadership quality is one of planning. It's a blueprint issue. If what you're dealing with is something of scale, so it's huge, knowable but huge, then you need confidence. So the leadership disposition is confidence. And if what you're dealing with is chaos, an unknown set of circumstances, an unknowable set of variables, then the leadership style you need, or the approach you need to take, is one of meaning. The meaning one, though, is the one I want to dwell on with enterprise. Why meaning? And that sounds terribly philosophical. And it's partly to do with the fact that we can't know what will work. Good enterprise is not about an old-school public sector disposition of creating a grand master plan for the next 5 years and then just slavishly following it. It's not about that. Good enterprise is about trying stuff and seeing what works, and then stopping doing the stuff that doesn't work and doing more of the stuff that does. And that means a wholly different approach to risk and a wholly different approach to what we see through, and indeed politics, because politics, as you know, politicians hate stopping doing things because it looks like they failed. So how do you enable that? Well, you've got to create a sense of joint meaning so that as many people as possible can be involved in the process of starting things, of bringing their ideas to the table. value, very often, and of course, different organisations in the museum sector are at very different positions, so I don't want to talk in gross generalisations, but very often the museum disposition is about adding value to the asset, so that interpretation is about how we can develop that asset. Whereas which is absolutely right and necessary, but it needs to be married by so that's, you could call that interpretation. But it needs to marry up against an understanding of the customer perspective, and indeed the customer, who the customers are, what their wants are, where they're coming from in terms of their needs. So adding value, the meaning of adding value has got to change, because the environment that we're faced with is so different from what it was even 5 years ago. The challenges are so different. We've got to change our focus and purpose in all sorts of ways, and that means changing the meaning we put on the phrase adding value. We've got to add value from a customer perspective as well as from an asset perspective. The word integrity has got very strong resonance in the museum sector, but it tends to have the sense of artistic integrity, about being true to our values and to our lights, rather than an integrity which responds to the wants of our customer set and says, how can the whole of what we're offering have coherence? How can it's one of the things that took me a while from being outside of the sector to grasp in the museum world. Very often the functions that happen within a museum organisation are very distinct from each other, people talk about silos, don't have a coherence in terms of a direction towards the customer. So the issue of integrity in terms of adding value, in terms of the entirety of the offer, is a particular point of focus, and particularly it seems to me a point of focus in terms of leadership. How do you create that sense of integrity of the offer, of the deliverable, as opposed to an artistic integrity kind of sense? Programming in the sector. The sense that we broadly see is that programming is about putting on a show, doing some activities, rather than programming being about how the entirety of the activity can come behind an offer which can then be exploited. So my colleague Joe will talk about the funnel. Joe's first training was in ergonomics, how you can, depending on your customer set, in the first instance, attract people who might be customers, and then feed them through a funnel towards your honeypot, your assets, the things which they find compelling. How do you do that? And as they go through that funnel, how do you add value to them? So how do they experience in adding a value? And if you're adding value to them, then they will pay you money, which is one of the things that we're trying to achieve. So what is the business of attracting them to the honeypot and making sure that the process of going through that funnel has the right frictions so that you can sell them things or give them things, and has the right lubrication so that people go through it effectively. So programming, how do we make sure that we are choosing exhibitions, choosing events in the light of what we know might be good retail offers, so that we're not seeing retail as being kind of after the event, now what products could we sit alongside this exhibition, but we're thinking about exhibition design in the light of known products and known product offerings. So we're inverting our process of programming, and we're thinking about programming as being a much bigger item. And then my last heading is about management. I'm going to draw something up on that again. This is where it bites, I think. Freedoms and control versus activity and purpose. So you know, as managers and as leaders, that getting the balance between freedom and control of your people is a key issue for you. It's always the difficult issue. And are you giving people freedom and control over what they do or what they're for in their jobs? And quite often what I think we're seeing is that people are, in the museum sector, have had freedom of purpose, so they've been able to pursue their particular interests and specialisms, but there's been very tight control over the particular activities they do. So you've got a disparate set of people with different specialisms and interests. It's my integrity point again, really. But actually their ability to spend money to do things in different ways in response to customers is very limited. And the world that we need to move towards is one where we've got very clear, control's not quite the right word, but very clear control over purpose, so that we have this is the meaning point again, we have a clear sense of what the organisation is there to achieve. And so, for instance, having very clear and easy performance charts, which everyone sees and everyone maps themselves against, is a very effective way of doing that, albeit a rather dry way of doing it. And then there's the more spiritual thing about what we're for, we're here for heritage, purpose, identity reasons. So moving towards a situation where we've got clear controls over purpose, but then freedoms in terms of activity at all levels in the organisation, so that people feel empowered, enabled to respond to the situations that they're facing when they face them. Why? Because if you accept my point about enterprise is about trying things, because you can't know what will work, so that you need people throughout the organisation to have freedoms to try things, but then to know how to measure whether they're succeeding or failing, so you know to stop them. Okay, so that's a bunch of theory. In practice, what we're seeing on the ground, I think, is that essentially two phases are being, people are going through two phases. The first phase is this reorientation issue and the removal of blockers. So the business of reorienting from an orientation which was more asset-oriented and very definitely politically oriented, because so much of the income came from a political direction. The business of reorienting from that to one which is more commercially oriented, or at least more customer adding value perspective, is principally about removing blockers. And a lot of that, and in the experiments that we've done, which have worked very well, and others, have been principally about focus. So removing blockers has been about focus. What I mean by focus? Well, focusing in on the revenue streams that offer the best results. So retail is clearly a key revenue stream. Simon, we were talking about corporate hire earlier on being a key revenue stream. Focusing on the blockers for those revenue streams being able to be successful. It's the funnel point again. So if we're talking about the public, what is the funnel for the public and how do we remove the blockers? One of the blockers we see in a lot of museums is a very simple one, which is that people can't find you. The signage is poor, be it websites or be it external signage. So the phase we're in, I think, at the moment is removing the blockers. And the management task is not about taking the initiative and saying, let's do X or let's do Y, but it's about removing the blockers so that the staff are able to be responsive. That's suite one, phase one, if you like. The second phase that we're starting, I think, to see people exploring is where you've got that machine humming. So you've got a responsive set of people who are absolutely attuned to the purpose of the organisation. So when you've got the machine humming like that, that's when the leadership and management task comes in, where you go back to this and say, how can we completely rethink the way we deploy our assets with other people's assets to create an offer which adds value to our customers?